The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Tick, tick, tick. My husband leaned across the polished oak table, his expensive cologne drifting faintly across the narrow space between us. His voice was low, but not low enough. "You can't even afford a lawyer, Carol." Then he laughed. It wasn't a big laugh, just a quick sharp burst, like he'd said something clever. His mistress laughed, too. A few people sitting in the benches behind us chuckled under their breath. Not loudly, just enough for me to hear it. I didn't react. I just stood there holding my stack of documents while the judge leaned back in his chair and looked over the top of his glasses. And a few minutes later, the same judge returned to my husband's lawyer and asked the question that froze the entire room. "You really don't know who she is." But that came later. First, let me tell you how I ended up standing in that courtroom with no lawyer. My name is Carol Whitaker. I was 52 years old that morning, and I'd spent 27 years married to a man who believed two things about me. First, that I was loyal. Second, that I wasn't very smart. For most of our marriage, those assumptions worked out pretty well for him. We lived in Columbus, Ohio. Daniel ran a mid-sized construction company called Whitaker Development. Commercial renovations, mostly strip malls, small office parks, medical buildings. Nothing flashy, but steady money. Back when we were young, it was just the two of us trying to keep the lights on. Daniel handled the job sites. I handled everything else. Permits, payroll, vendor payments, insurance forms, taxes. There were nights when I'd sit at the kitchen table until 2 o'clock in the morning with a calculator and a stack of invoices while Daniel slept upstairs because he had to be up at 5. I didn't mind. That's what marriage was supposed to be. To people building something together. The company grew slowly. Then it grew quickly. By the time we hit our 20th anniversary, Whitaker Development had 30 employees and contracts all over central Ohio. That was around the time Daniel decided he didn't need my help anymore. It didn't happen all at once. First, he hired an outside accountant, then a project manager, then a financial controller. Eventually, he told me one night over dinner that the company had gotten too complicated for me to keep up with. "You've done enough, Carol," he said, cutting into his steak. "Let the professionals handle it." I remember nodding and saying, "Okay." Because after 20 years, you trust your husband when he says things like that. Looking back, that was the moment everything started changing. About 6 years later, I started noticing something else changing too. Daniel was suddenly working later, traveling more, buying new suits. At first, I figured it was business. Then I noticed the texts. Nothing explicit, just short messages that popped up on his phone when he left it on the counter. "Dinner tomorrow. Miss you already. Call me when she's asleep." The woman's name was Lauren. Lauren Carter. She was a real estate agent who handled commercial listings. Early 30s, blonde, very polished. I met her once at a company event. She shook my hand like we were meeting at a job interview. "Daniel talks about you all the time," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes. A few months later, Daniel filed for divorce. He didn't try to hide the reason. "We've grown apart," he said across the kitchen table. But 2 weeks after that conversation, I saw Lauren climb into his truck outside a restaurant on High Street. So much for growing apart. The divorce papers arrived 6 months later. Daniel had already hired one of the most aggressive divorce attorneys in Columbus, Robert Finch. Finch had a reputation in Franklin County courtrooms. Expensive, ruthless, very good at what he did. And what he did that morning was paint a picture of me that almost sounded believable. According to him, I was a financially dependent housewife who had contributed very little to the success of Whittaker Development. Daniel, on the other hand, had built the company through hard work and independent leadership. The courtroom smelled faintly like old wood and coffee. Lauren was sitting behind Daniel in the gallery seats, legs crossed, wearing a pale blue dress that probably cost more than my entire outfit. Every once in a while, she'd lean forward and whisper something in his ear. At one point, she said something loud enough for me to hear. Maybe if she'd spent less time shopping and more time learning a real job, she could afford a lawyer. Daniel chuckled. Then he leaned toward me and delivered the line that started this story. "You can't even afford a lawyer, Carol." I turned my head and looked at him, not angry, not hurt, just calm, because the truth was I could afford one. I just hadn't hired one. When the judge asked if I had legal representation, I stood up and said, "Your Honor, I'll be representing myself today." A few people laughed. Finch actually smiled. The judge didn't. He simply nodded and said, "Very well, Mrs. Whittaker." Then he looked down at the paperwork in front of him. The hearing began. Finch spent the next 30 minutes explaining why Daniel deserved nearly everything: the business, most of the assets, the investment accounts. He spoke smoothly, confidently, the way attorneys do when they think the outcome is already decided. Daniel sat there relaxed, one arm draped over the back of his chair, like he was watching a movie. Lawrence smiled the whole time. Finally, the judge turned toward me. "Mrs. is Whittaker," he said. "You may question the witness." My chair creaked softly as I stood up. My hands were steady. I walked to the small podium in front of the judge's bench and placed a binder on the surface. Daniel watched me with that same amused expression, like he was waiting for the entertainment to start. I opened the binder and flipped to the first page. Then I looked directly at my husband, Mr. Whittaker. I said, my voice clear in the quiet room. "Do you recognize a company called Riverbend Supply?" He shrugged. "Sure, one of our vendors." I nodded slowly. Behind him, Lauren shifted in her seat. I reached into my folder and pulled out a document. The courtroom clock ticked again. Tick tick. I placed the paper on the projector. And that's when the first crack appeared in Daniel Whittaker's perfect little story. I'd like to tell you that the moment I placed that document on the projector, everything changed. It didn't. Not right away. Daniel still looked relaxed. Finch still had that polite little courtroom smile. Lauren was still leaning back in her chair like she was watching a show, because none of them understood yet what they were looking at. And that misunderstanding had been working in my favor for months. But to explain that, I need to take you back to the night I first realized something was wrong. It was late October, one of those cold Ohio nights when the wind rattles the windows and the whole house feels hollow after someone leaves. Daniel had already moved out by then. Most of his things were gone. The closet looked like someone had pulled half the books off a shelf and forgotten to come back. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop and a glass of iced tea. Old habit. For 20 years, that table had been my office. Payroll forms, vendor checks, tax filings. Every piece of paper that kept Whittaker Development running had passed across that would surface at some point. Even after Daniel pushed me out of the company finances, I still knew where things were, and I still knew how to read them. That night, I had logged into the shared tax archive we'd used for years. The accountant hadn't changed the passwords yet. Probably assumed I wouldn't bother looking. I wasn't looking for trouble. Honestly, I was looking for closure. I wanted to understand how the business I helped build had turned into something I was suddenly shut out of. The first hour was boring. Balance sheets, vendor invoices, equipment leases, normal stuff. Then I noticed a name that didn't ring any bells. Riverbend Supply. The invoice was small, just under $30,000. That wasn't unusual. Construction companies pay vendors constantly. Lumber, steel, electrical equipment. But something about the name bothered me. After 20 years of bookkeeping, you remember your vendors. Riverbend wasn't one of them. I searched the records. Another payment popped up. Then another, then another. By midnight, I had a spreadsheet open and my stomach was starting to tighten. Riverbend Supply had been paid hundreds of times. Sometimes 20,000, sometimes 60, sometimes more. Over 5 years. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. It didn't make sense, so I opened the Ohio Business Registry and typed the company name into the search bar. The result appeared in about 2 seconds. Riverbend Supply LLC, registered for years earlier, owner D. Whitaker. My first reaction was confusion. D could have meant anything. Daniel Donald. But when I clicked the registration file and saw the mailing address, I felt something cold settle in my chest. A PO box in Dublin, Ohio, the same post office Daniel had used for years when he needed mail that didn't go through the house. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I closed the laptop because in that moment, I realized 2 things at once. First, my husband had been quietly moving money out of the company. Second, if I started pulling that thread, the whole sweater might unravel. And unraveling it wouldn't just hurt Daniel. It could destroy the business. The business that paid 30 employees. The business Daniel's daughter Emily was supposed to inherit one day. Emily was 23 by then, living in California, working her first real job. I had helped raise her. Her mother died when she was 9. Brain aneurysm.